Hey everybody, this is Mr. Maupin coming at you here. Hopefully everyone is doing all right. What we're going to be doing is taking a look at topic 1.2 for AP Government. This is entitled Types of Democracy. Now this is going to be a two-part video. Before we get into some content talking about different types of democracy, you'll notice here at the beginning of these notes that this goes into a little bit of an introduction regarding the multiple choice portion of the AP test that you're going to be taking in May. We'll be going over this section in class. We'll do some practice questions, etc., etc. So keeping that in mind, what we're going to do now is we're going to scroll down and take a look at what we call representative democracy. Now, of course, when we talk about democracy, democracy is, of course, the idea of government of the people. But of course, it becomes a lot more complicated than just that basic notion. For example, you might talk to people, on the streets and they'll say that, well, America is a democracy. And that's true, but not all democracies are the same. When we talk about, for example, a participatory democracy, it is the idea that most of us think of when we think of a democracy, where we say it is the people themselves that are actually running the government. But even when we say that it is a government run by the people, that even requires some more classification. For example, one type of participatory democracy is what we call a direct democracy. Now, a direct democracy, as the name implies, is talking about a government where all citizens make decisions directly in government. In other words, it's where all people vote on all things. Now, this idea of a direct democracy has very, very, very deep roots, going all the way back to ancient Athens. We're talking, well back, talking about 2,500 years ago, approximately. Now, note, when we say in a direct democracy, all the people make all the decisions themselves, a key word in this is citizens, especially if you go back to the model of ancient Athens. All citizens were able to make decisions on all government decisions, but a very small minority of the population actually qualified as being a citizen. That did not include women, and it did not include slaves, which were the majority of the population in that place and time. But it does mean, though, that on every decision of government, all of the citizens will have the ability to have a vote. Now, that is really good in terms of it being the purest, the freest form of democracy, but it does not, though, come without shortcomings and challenges. For many, a very easy problem with a direct democracy is that it's not very pragmatic on many levels. Imagine for a moment having the U.S. government run as a direct democracy. Imagine the federal government existing not with a Congress and a House, a House and a Senate that we know today, but literally all, 300 plus million Americans that are citizens being able to vote on every single issue that affects the federal government. Well, as you can imagine, that would be extremely, extremely difficult to achieve. So, first off, a direct democracy cannot really be functional in a large-scale system. Today, when we look at direct democracies are on a very small scale. You do have some areas, for example, there are certain little towns in New England, for example, that might have, 50 people living in them, and they will organize a direct democracy to make decisions on very, very local matters. But outside of that, it's just really too impractical to be able to run a government of any real size as a direct democracy. Now, besides the impracticality of it in terms of numbers, there's also going to be the concern that the Founding Fathers had in terms of what they call majoritarianism. And it's basically the idea of the will of the majority to make all decisions. For us in our society, when we think of a government, or at least a fair government, we just automatically assume majoritarianism. When we talk about as a group, all right, what do we want to have for lunch today? We go with majority rules, and that idea of majority rules sounds reasonable, seems to make sense. You're making decisions that most people want. But there is a downside to majoritarianism, and the founders certainly had issues with majoritarianism. The founding fathers worried about a potential tyranny of the majority if we created a government that placated to the desires of the majority in every circumstance. Now, what the founding fathers were concerned about in terms of majoritarianism was the reality of applying wealth and status to a society. The founding fathers we would not normally think of as minorities in the modern sense. We're not talking about women. We're not talking about people of color. We're not talking about members of the LGBT community or anything along those lines. But they were a minority in the reality that they were highly educated. They were of the super wealthy. They had the most land. And from their perspective, the most to lose in a new democratic style government. If you run a government with majoritarian principles, then that means that what the majority of the people want are going to get. Well, if most of the people are relatively poor and they see a very small minority of elites that exist out there that have most of the money, well, it's not going to be too hard to imagine that a majoritarian government will basically strip these founding fathers of their wealth and status against their will. And these founding fathers did not want that to happen. So the idea of a direct democracy, though it is a democracy in its purest sense, does come with pragmatic challenges and was certainly not something that was the priority as far as the founding fathers were concerned. Now, you might hear them go, hey, Mr. Maupin, you're telling me the founding fathers didn't believe in democracy? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the founding fathers were not supporters of a pure direct democracy, certainly at a national level. They were much more in support of what we would call a representative democracy, aka a republic. Now, republics date back to ancient Rome. A republic differs from a direct democracy in that, whereas a direct democracy once again has all the citizens making all the decisions of government, in a republic, it is the citizens that choose representatives amongst themselves to make the decisions for the nation or the society as a whole. It's what we would describe as an indirect democracy, whereas we as citizens pick our representatives. We have the freedom to do that, but we as the citizens do not make all the decisions of government. It is our representatives that we chose who make those decisions for us. Now, a representative democracy in many respects is this nice sweet spot, kind of a compromise between a direct democracy, which we just mentioned a moment ago, and authoritarian governments, where you have a singular person that makes all the decisions for everybody without any type of real input from the people. So a representative democracy is something that is much more what the founders wanted in terms of government. A type of democracy that would not necessarily be under the control of the majority in all circumstances. Now, we'll get more into the details of how this is going to apply to the U.S. Constitution later, but just understand from a theoretical perspective that the founders were much more in favor of a representative democracy, a republic, not a direct democracy. Now, that being said, if we do live in a participatory democracy, which you can certainly argue, understand that participation comes in many different forms. For example, even though I just said a moment ago that we do not operate as an entire system as a direct democracy, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we as the people do directly make decisions on. For example, there are referendums and initiatives that exist out there. To kind of boil it down, these are ways for the people themselves to directly vote on actions of government. So, for example, a referendum allows the people via a ballot to make decisions on policy. So, for example, here in Ohio, we have legalized casino gambling via referendum. It's not that the Ohio General Assembly or the Ohio legislature voted that into creation. It was the people themselves that had a measure on the ballot to legalize casino gambling, and it was approved by a majority of the people. So understand that, you do have that component of a taste of direct democracy in some respects. Now note, initiatives and referendums are only found at the state level. We do not operate this at the national level, but there is that little taste of direct democracy there. Also, we have to also keep in mind that participation in a democracy is not simply limited to voting. That's normally what we think of, and it is the most common way that we do participate in our government, but participation comes in many different forms and facets. It can come in the form of raising and donating money to political causes. It can be involved in organizing protests. It can be involved in grassroots activities to get people registered to vote, things like that. It can be involved in all sorts of different activism regarding the government. So that, folks, is a participatory democracy. And I think we're probably going to leave it there for the moment. We'll come back. We'll do another video on elite democracy and pluralist democracy. Okay? We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.